Well, thank you very much, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here again with the National Association of Pension Funds. Yes, indeed, I am now Lord Hague of Richmond. As you say, this is one of my first utterances. As a Lord, I will have to stop telling jokes now about the House of Lords that I've been doing for decades. I've always been telling the story of the man who dreamt he was giving a speech in the House of Lords and woke up to find that he was. Now it might be me actually in that situation. And I do recall our meeting 22 years ago when that's how long ago it is, when I was Minister of Pensions. And I did just say, that's when we were dealing with GMP equalisation. I had no idea you were still dealing with it 22 years later. So good luck with that for the next 22 years. And I remember one of the letters I received when I was Pensions Minister that said, "Dear Mr. Hague," and it asked for more money on their pension. It said, if I get more money as a result of writing to you, you can have half. And then rather optimistically underneath it said, "P.S. don't tell anybody." This joins all the long pile of letters I've saved over the years. One from one of my former Yorkshire constituents said, "I hope you can take some constructive criticism of your recent speech. It was rubbish." My favourite ever letter was very short, and it said, "Dear Mr. Hague, the Taliban have taken over Anne Widdecombe's body and no one has noticed." No other comment at all. It was just that. As Pensions Minister, and then as Welsh Secretary, and then as Foreign Secretary, I dealt, as many of you deal, with civil servants and officials for years, and I have actually learned, I was a minister for so long, I learned how to translate what officials say into English. I can help you with some of the translations, if you like, because when they say something like, "This work is ongoing," it means we are nowhere near finishing it at all. Or if they say, "This is a comprehensive review," it means unlike a normal review, this one will go on for so long we can ignore the results of it. If they say this policy has been subject to careful peer review, it means we've asked all our friends and they like it. Discussions between officials are continuing, means we're in the middle of a furious argument. We are engaging in a deep dive analysis of this subject, means our understanding of this subject is zero. This is one I always enjoyed at the Foreign Office. We are ramping up our response to this situation. That means none of us saw this coming at all. And then, they have the way they express things to ministers in official submissions, putting things in a kind of gentle way. We are analysing your manifesto commitment. That means no one knows how on earth to implement this. We welcome ministers' engagement in this process. Means this was all running fine until you interfered with it. There has been a mixed reaction to your announcement. Means everybody thinks it's a terrible idea. There is pushback in government to your announcement. Means number 10 thinks it's a terrible idea. We will return to you with fully worked up options. Means you won't recognise your policy when we bring it back. And finally, we need to consider new options urgently. It means you might be a minister, but you are off your trolley. So this is how I hope this helps you to interpret official documents in future. But of course, I miss some of the civil servants a little bit, and will miss the voters. Although I retired from government at the election, I had a marvellous encounter with a lady on the doorstep in the election a few months ago. Where I said, "I've come to see if you'll vote Conservative on Thursday," and she said, "Shh." I said, "Well, it's the election's on Thursday. I've come to see if..." She said, "Shh, don't be quiet, Mr. Hague." I said, "Well, what's the matter? Is somebody asleep?" She said, "No, my husband's in the back. He votes Labour, and I've told him the election's on Friday." So, if you think we politicians are scheming Machiavellian people, just try the voters. They can be worse. But you have asked me to talk about making sense of this uncertain world and what you need to know. And of course, the political world, the general election, was a classic example of that uncertain world, because the outcome was, well, according to most observers, pretty uncertain. Turned out not to be very uncertain at all. It came as a bit of a shock. One of my other jobs, apart from knocking on doors, one of my jobs in the election was after every TV debate between the party leaders, I had to appear on News at 10 to say whatever happened, David Cameron had come out best. Whatever, even if he had arrived late, fallen over, refused to answer any questions and fainted, I would have said he clearly came best out of this. In fact, even the debate he didn't take part in, I don't know if you were watching that night, I was on News at 10 saying he came best out of it. And funnily enough, he did. That was the really astonishing thing. But we had all those polls in that election. We had more data, and there is a lesson in this, not just about politics and polls, but perhaps about economics and world affairs in general. We had more data than ever before about how people were going to vote. More expense was spent on that data than ever before. There was more analysis and more minutely detailed prediction than ever before in a British general election, and it was all garbage. It was worthless on election day. It was that bad, and they're still trying to analyze why it was that bad. I'm not going to go into all the many reasons why, because the point I'm making is a more general one. We can get hooked on the assumption that certain data is correct, and that the way things have always worked is the way they're going to continue to work, and if we've got even more information about it, that must be right. But actually it may be wrong, because a lot of the assumptions that we might make about the direction of world affairs can be wrong. And certainly in the political world, we now see these sudden insurgencies on the left and the right. And they are Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in America. They are a party led by comedians in Italy. It's now the second largest party. They are Marine Le Pen in France. They are the Greek Syriza. They are Nigel Farage and Jeremy Corbyn here in Britain. They are all part of the same phenomenon that is fueled by anger. There is an anger on the left about the global financial crisis, the feeling that banks and governments got away with something at the expense of normal people. And there's anger on the right, a feeling the world has changed culturally and in many ways without people being asked about whether they wanted it to change, and they resent that. And now in the vast majority of cases, these political insurgencies are not going to take over government. In an extreme crisis like in Greece, they do actually become the government, with further implications I will come to a bit later. But in most cases, they're not going to. Donald Trump is not going to become president of the United States, he says confidently. I may be just as wrong as all those pollsters, of course. Bernie Sanders is not going to defeat Hillary Clinton to be the Democratic presidential nominee. Here's a forecast. Jeremy Corbyn is not going to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And I don't say that in a kind of smug conservative way, because actually I think it's not good for the United Kingdom if there is not an opposition waiting to take over. Politics requires a credible alternative government. And it's not good for another reason, which is that if people in Scotland think there is going to be a permanent Conservative government in London, they are actually more likely to vote for Scotland to break away from the rest of the United Kingdom. So what happens in the Labour leadership, even in opposition, can make a really material difference to the whole future of the country. It would be easy, of course, in this political situation for Conservatives to be complacent. They have the Labour Party convulsed by a revolution they weren't expecting. The moderate left has ideologically and intellectually collapsed. Liberal Democrats nearly wiped off the map. UKIP managed to be split even though they've only got one MP, which is an interesting novelty. But, of course, the winners of an election have immense challenges, the biggest challenges of all. And the government faces three immense challenges. One is to maintain the strong performance of the economy. I can't say we anymore, have achieved the fastest economic growth of any advanced nation in the world. All the warnings of the IMF 3 years ago were wrong. Another thing that was quite wrong. There is a massive expenditure on infrastructure coming. Real decentralization is coming. There will be, within a couple of years, a kind of Mancunian Boris, if you can imagine such a thing, here in Manchester. Lower taxes on businesses and households are coming. A balanced budget is coming if all goes to plan. The threats to the British economy are cyclical and external, rather than that there will be a sharp change in policy. But that is one challenge. The second is to keep Scotland within the United Kingdom. And today the Scottish National Party are having their conference, and Nicola Sturgeon is going to say apparently the time is not right for another referendum. But I think you can expect another referendum within, say, 9 years in Scotland, within the life of 2 more Scottish parliaments. And the timing of that will be dictated by 2 things. There is a life cycle to all things, including political parties. And when Scottish nationalists start to suffer the problems of long-term incumbency and making a lot of mistakes, their popularity will come down. And if you imagine that on a graph, and on the same graph, oil prices, and whenever they move up in the future, it's when those 2 intersect that is the moment the Scottish nationalists have to have another referendum, or it will be too late. And so that is likely to happen given the strength of that party, and that will be a second and decisive either way referendum. That is a major challenge. And the third, of course, is the referendum on the EU, a massive decision for British people to make in a referendum within the next 25 months. It has to be held by November 2017. And people are saying, and they're saying today, as the Prime Minister meets the President of the European Commission today, where is the detail? Where is the list of British demands? And the answer, of course, is that if there was a list of British demands produced now, it would be quite a mistake to do that, because every idea, every suggestion would then become a red line that it was impossible to retreat from. Because it was being negotiated in public. This is a negotiation that has to be shaped behind the scenes, and therefore might seem quite frustrating to people as it goes along. It has to be, it's like laying an egg in the end. The finished product has to come out. That can't then be messed around with later on without the whole structure collapsing. And so this, I think, will come to a crunch in early 2016 with a referendum between late 16 and late 17. There are 5 key areas the British government needs progress in negotiations on, and I can discuss these more in questions if you like, but briefly on migration, without changing the principle of freedom of movement, on ever closer union, on greater powers for national parliaments, on clear protection for countries not in the Eurozone, permanently not in the Eurozone in our case, in decisions by the single market, and ideally some real direction and momentum to boosting the competitiveness of the European Union in the world, completing the single market in energy, the digital single market, and so on. My own feeling is that this will be a successful process. Has to be my feeling. I was one of the people who thought of it in the first place. But that is still my feeling. Countries around Europe differ greatly in their attitudes. Countries that subscribe to every aspect of European Union, like Spain, may well think it is a distraction, a waste of time. Countries closely linked to Britain in the EU, like Ireland and the Netherlands, are desperate for it to succeed, whatever happens. A country like France is very concerned about it because they don't want a change in European rules that require a referendum in France, because they think it's impossible to win a referendum in France on any European subject, or with the present government, which it probably is. A country like Poland, which has a general election in 10 days' time, may become much more supportive of the UK's position after its referendum. And the real decision maker on this is Germany. The EU used to be run a few years ago by a Franco-German axis. Now it is run by a German axis. And that's the heart of the decision making on this. And Germany, the German leaders across parties, believe privately and publicly that it is in the strong economic and strategic interests of Germany to keep the UK within the European Union. And that means they will go some way. It does not mean they can deliver everything, but they will go some way to trying to make sure there is a successful negotiation and that the government can recommend a yes vote. And my view, given that polls are little use these days, we might as well guess the outcome. And my guess is the British public are about 60-40 on the whole in favour of EU membership on an average day. But you have to get them on an average day. And that, of course, is the challenge of referendum timing. But in an uncertain world, one of the uncertainties is about the European Union itself, not just about British membership of the European Union. The EU is fond of stress testing financial institutions, rightly so, of course, after the global financial crisis. But if you subjected the policies and institutions of the European Union to stress tests of the stresses they're likely to come under over the next few decades, you would not conclude that they would be likely to survive. It would not pass its own stress tests if such an exercise was carried out. I believe the deal with Greece will prove unsustainable, financially unsustainable, and probably politically unsustainable. The record of governments implementing a program they themselves disagree with is not an encouraging one. And that is what is expected to happen now in Greece. But I think there is a wider problem for the Eurozone than just the position of Greece. In my view, as a long-standing critic of the Euro, the integration of the Eurozone, the political and economic integration of the Eurozone, which is essential to its long-term functioning, will prove extremely difficult because it will become clear that it involves Germans and Finns and Dutch people paying all their lives for people in other parts of the Eurozone. And some of those people depending on decisions made in Berlin for all their lives, that there has been a permanent change. That will be very difficult for people to accept. And on top of that, I think that it's more likely that southern and northern European countries within the Euro will diverge in their economic performance rather than converge, placing immense strains on that currency and particularly those that find it hard to compete at the same interest rate and exchange rate as applies in Germany. So I continue to believe we are in the beginnings of the Eurozone crisis, not the end of the Eurozone crisis. And I think the Schengen zone will also be subject to intolerable pressure. And with this subject we come to wider global sources of instability, one that many of you know well, which is the demographic source of instability. Everybody knows demographic change is important, but they've not all caught up with the sheer speed and scale of what is going to happen in the world over the next 35 years to the middle of the century. People are well up with the idea the population of the UK is set to continue to grow strongly. The population of the world is set to grow strongly. But of the 200 countries in the world, it looks like a quarter of them are going to fall in population over the next 35 years, subject to any new migration trends. Most of those are in Europe. And since half the world's population increase is expected in Africa, this means over the next generation, the increase in the population of Africa, just the increase, is going to be considerably greater than the entire population of the whole of Europe today. And imagine the migration pressures that is going to create. It means that the so-called migration crisis of recent months is a tiny foretaste of what is to come. And I don't believe that the Schengen area will come through that situation intact. There are many other important features of the rapidly evolving demographic change. For instance, that emerging economies that have now hit many structural problems also have more rapidly aging populations than we did when we were an emerging economy. They will have an aged population probably before many of them have developed the financial and physical infrastructure to cope with that much greater age of population, which is an important factor in assessing the future of many of the emerging, still developing economies. On top of that, there are other major sources of instability in the world. Most of them seem to kick off within a few months of me becoming Foreign Secretary in 2010. At one point, I did a tour of Tunisia, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, and Egypt, and all of them within a few weeks had a revolution or a civil war. The Prime Minister said to me, "Do you think it's actually you that's causing it?" And I was one of the last people to visit President Assad in the last weeks before the war began in Syria. And I said to him, "Do you think there is going to be violence like there has been in Egypt?" And he said, no, it could not possibly happen here in Syria. Another example of how our assumptions may be catastrophically wrong. And he thought he knew his country. But one of the things fueling this is an otherwise very positive development. The information revolution that has given us so much new opportunity is fueling political instability by creating a demand for responsiveness and accountability in government. And you can see that in what happened in Tunisia or in Egypt. You can see it in the demonstrations in Brazil. Wherever there is what people see as a corrupt government or economically ineffective government, now there is a much greater tendency for leaderless political movements to arise quite rapidly. Add that to another source of instability, religious intolerance in the Middle East that has grown over the last half century, a massive subject in itself to analyze that. And you get the rapid growth of ISIL or ISIS that has been able to mushroom in strength more rapidly than it could ever have done before the age of social media. Add to that we live in a more multipolar world with more centers of decision-making than ever before in the history of the world, with a perceived reduction in the power of a small number of countries, of the United States and its Western allies, which means others step in to fill the vacuum. And when you add all those things together, you have greater instability and greater unpredictability in world affairs than we have had for some time. I think it means the next quarter of a century is a much more unstable and unpredictable period than the last quarter of a century. And the last quarter of a century included 9/11, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. We are heading into a less stable period than that in the next quarter of a century. And overlaid on that, just to completely depress you, is unusual economic uncertainty. There's always economic uncertainty, but I think here this relates to my earlier point about opinion polls. Long-standing assumptions may no longer hold. My own personal view, I'm not an economist, but since it was shown in one study a couple of weeks ago that randomly chosen members of the public can come up with predictions as accurate as experts on many subjects, we might as well all have a go at this. My own personal view, and I'm not just saying this to empathize with pension funds, is that, for instance, the key assumption that low rates of interest stimulate economic activity probably fails over time, particularly when they are persisted in for a very long period of time, that this loses its effectiveness as a cure and creates problems that may be as serious as the original disease. And I think the quantitative easing that we've seen that has gone along with those low interest rates has the effect of inflating prices of assets that are mainly owned by rich people, and therefore exacerbates problems of wealth and income distribution in the world. There is already political resentment about that. So these are not policies that can be continued indefinitely, and getting off them is a very difficult challenge. I do fear that central banks may be losing the moment to start raising interest rates. There's always a good reason not to, and will become trapped in a loose monetary policy for too long when it has ceased to be effective. So these are all my dire views. If it is true that politics has these insurgencies that arise more quickly than ever, that in economics central banks are pulling levers that don't work anymore, that the European Union is going to struggle to function, that we are facing massive long-term forces that generate instability in the world, that if emerging economies face major structural problems, you may be sitting there thinking, what hope is there for any of us? But I would insist, despite believing all of that, that we should remain optimistic about world affairs. Partly because in the jobs I've done, you have to be an optimist. If you get up every morning to face dozens of situations of death and disaster around the globe, you don't get through the day if you are not an optimist. So I admit to that. But partly because you can see what's happened here in the United Kingdom in the last few years, how economic confidence has been restored through policies that the detail of which people may agree with or disagree with. But it has, and you can see how quickly, if you get things fundamentally right, you start getting the rewards of that. And partly because, and on a much bigger scale, the advance of science is such that it will bring major further social and economic breakthroughs over the coming few decades. One of the most fascinating things I was able to glimpse in my travels as Foreign Secretary was the work of a place like the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and to see how close we are now to massive world-changing breakthroughs in energy, in lightweight materials, which are being worked on here at the National Graphene Institute at Manchester. And these have the potential to extend, continue, and even exceed the information revolution and the implications for communication, for transport, for production. And so I think those things are likely in some form to take world affairs in a positive direction over the next few decades. And also there is a huge potential for decisions to go right as well as wrong in managing all these sources of instability. There is a good deal of diplomatic success going on in the world. If you just look at the last few months, a nuclear deal with Iran that has removed any threat in the next decade of open conflict with Iran and in that part of the Middle East. America has opened up relations with Cuba, rather long overdue. Colombia has brought to the edge of success its peace process after 50 years of conflict that will change dramatically if it works that part of Latin America. The problems of the Middle East may look intractable, and they are. I can tell you they are. But there are golden keys that, if you can get hold of them, can turn the lock on those conflicts. An improved relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, remote though that may seem, could actually positively affect conflicts and tension in an entire arc across the Middle East, in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen. Stranger things have happened, although it is only something to hope for at the moment. And many of these key choices that will affect world affairs positively or negatively, depending on the decisions made, will be made in China. And it is the Chinese leadership that we should all study carefully, and their comments and their thinking over the coming months and years. There are really three key questions to watch. One is, is it possible to combine more centralized political power with a more open market economy? My answer to that is no, that it will prove unsustainable in the end, but only in the very long term in the case of China. But it does mean that where there is a conflict between the power of the Communist Party and the creation of the true market economy, they will put the power of the Communist Party first. And that was clear in what happened in the stock exchange falls in August, and the official response to that, which is something you wouldn't have seen anywhere in the Western world. China will be from now on a massive economy. We have to give it more attention, as actually a whole string of British governments have been doing. But it's not going to turn into us or turn into the United States. The second question is, will their foreign policy support their economic policy? A choice they've not had to face before in the history of China. But if they want to bring Asian countries together in greater prosperity, it's not sustainable at the same time to have tensions with those countries over territory in the South China Sea. And the final question, the big one to watch in world affairs, is China going to enter into strategic partnership with the United States or into strategic competition with the United States? And on that question, a huge amount, a great deal of the course of world affairs will depend. In the summit a few weeks ago between President Xi Jinping and President Obama, you could see some encouraging signs. Agreement on climate change between China and the United States, nominal agreement on cyber security. But there's a long way to go. You can envisage a China that helps to defuse the crazed leadership of North Korea, that administers its aid in Africa in a way that promotes good political and economic development. You can imagine such a China working in partnership with the US and other Western countries. But you can also imagine cyber attacks on a massive scale, competition in maritime power in East Asia, creating strategic competition instead. So on those decisions of a small group of people at the top of China, a great deal would depend over the coming years. When you take these things together, the potential for things to go in the right direction despite all the instability, what you have is a trend in world affairs in which more people will lead healthier and happier, and a bit disturbingly for some of you, much longer lives. The trend in human utility and happiness will remain upwards, in my view. But there will be greater instability and unpredictability along that trend. It will be more important to have local knowledge of each country because there will be greater variation and unpredictability. It will be more important to build resilience into government and business decisions, to cope with entirely unexpected events, and to make decisions in such a way that there are options at a later stage to make substantial changes to those decisions, to build resilience and flexibility into those decisions. So a more unstable world for many, many powerful reasons, but very clear reasons to build resilience and flexibility into what we decide. That is my recommendation to you today. Thank you very much indeed.